Greetings and welcome to this tutorial on variables and data types. As with any programming language, UiPath being no exception, variables are one of the most foundational topics you'll ever come across when it comes to software or application development. In this case, automation development. The principle or underlying understanding of variables is all about allowing the computer in this case, or robots or automations, to be able to hold values while the automation is executing or running. One of the analogies that I always try to use when discussing this topic with folks that are just now beginning to play with Studio or potentially even beginning their experiences with programming per se is obviously what's needed when we build our automations. When we talk about variables, I try to think about what life is like when you're moving from house to house, or an apartment to your new house, or apartment to apartment, whatever. You're in the act of moving from location A to location B. And what do people do? We have boxes and upon boxes that we load all of our stuff into as we move from A to B, location A to B. What do we put on the outside of those boxes that we're moving our stuff in? Usually you put what room. So this is the box that has all the kitchen stuff in it. Obviously many boxes of kitchen things, but specifically as we talk about variables, this notion of it's a box that holds something. It holds things. If you say kitchen box, it holds all things kitchen, things that belong in and from the kitchen. We wouldn't put things from the bathroom in the kitchen box or vice versa. Obviously you got a box, and obviously boxes that hold things for the bathroom, and that's where stuff from the bathroom goes into bedroom, etc. So think the tricky part with variables in this analogy all has to do with the fact that a variable can only hold one thing at a time. So if we put a mixing bowl in the kitchen box, that's all that box can hold. Kind of fast forwarding in thought, we're not going to get into it in specific detail in this conversation, but this concept of an array that we'll talk about here in just a couple of activities, an array allows a variable to hold multiple things. But for our purposes here in conversation, a variable only holds a single thing at a time. It does not have the capability to hold multiple things at a time, as does an array, as I had mentioned here a moment ago, will allow us to hold multiple things in that same box. So that's kind of the weird thing with this analogy that I'm talking about, that a variable only holds a single value at a time, only can hold one thing. So if we have the mixing bowl in the kitchen box for moving, and we need to bring in a plate and store it in the box, the mixing bowl has to come out before the plate can then go in. And obviously if you want to put a knife or a spoon in, same thing, the plate has to come out before we put the knife or spoon in. Variables only hold a single thing at a time. More specifically, we talked about the idea of the kitchen versus the bathroom box. What we talk about with variables specifically is variables have data types attached to them. Data types implies what type of value or thing can that variable hold. Can the variable hold letters and numbers, or what we call text, or in the actual technical lingo of UiPath Studio, what we call a string type variable, as opposed to can the variable, or using the analogy again, the box, can it only hold numeric value? And more specifically, numeric value that can be computed or calculated. So not to be too confusing, remember string variables can hold letters and numbers, both, or just a number, but those values can't inherently be computed. They're treated as raw text, plain, human readable text. When we deal with the variables that are of numeric type, those values can then be used in algebraic type expressions, mathematic based expressions. It can be computed upon. to being treated as an actual number. But again, kitchen box being things that only, are kitchen items going into that box. If it's a variable of type string, that variable can only hold letters and numbers. If it is of a numeric type, we'll talk about integer and double for a couple of examples. Integer being a whole number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. A double variable being, any type of number, including decimal base values, so 1.5, 1.25, 1.333, for 1 1/3, etc. One of the other data types that we'll come across that's very commonly used is what we call a Boolean data type. So the box can only hold a yes or no type value or a true or false type value. Synonymous there. Boolean holds true, false, yes, no. You could think of it as on-off type statements, or I should say variables. So to try to bring all this to reality, let's run through a couple of examples here, being able to role play this out. So I'm inside of UiPath Studio right now. I just launched it. Remember, this is our main splash screen or page that is loaded when we first get into Studio. We're going to do this multiple times over and over again for every single activity. Our goal here is to build a library of little mini projects that you can always come back and re-reference from the work that we do throughout this entire course. So in this case, what I'm alluding to here is the ability to create a new process. Here we're going to create multiple blank, basic little simple processes or mini projects, mini automations. So simply click on New Project Process. Recall this is going to prompt us where do we want to save our projects. I'm going to go ahead and stay with my default folder here, and we will call this one variables and data types. Again, I want to keep it in my root folder here. Description, how about playing around with variables and their respective data types. Again, a meaningful description that's going to show up underneath each of the actual project names here. Once you have this done, simply click Create. Their new project file will be built. Give it a moment here to load. And again, UiPath Studio will always bring us to this page when we create a new project. Again, recall we could go over here to the project tab and open up the main here, or you could simply hit the main workflow here. Recall this is going to bring us to what I call the canvas view. This is where we begin our masterpiece, our work of art, our actual automation. What do we want the computer, or in this case, what do we want our robots to do for us? In this case, we're going to do some basic introductory topics here as it pertains to variables, which, as we talk about variables, notice there's a tab down here at the bottom. But at this point, it says select an activity in which to set variable scope. Right now, we do not have any activities pulled in, so before we can play with variables, we need to have something that we can begin playing around with some of our variables. So to do this, let's bring in a simple write line activity for a moment. Recall, write line allows us to put output down here in the bottom. And once I have this activity brought in, notice my ability to create variables is now enabled. The first thing I would like to talk about is how do we declare a new variable. And in order to declare a new variable, again, this is the writing on the outside of the moving box, going back to that analogy. We need to give the variable a name. In this case, what I'm going to type here is str my first variable. If I can spell variable correctly, there we go. What I'm doing here with notice I have a prefix str. This stands for string. I'm allowing the variable name to be prefixed with what type of variable is this. So you'll see str or int or dbl. So int for integer, dbl for double, str for string. You'll see bool for boolean. At this rate, str is going to imply that this is going to be a string-based variable. What I'm talking about here is underneath the variable types. if I expand this out, what should this variable hold is what we're talking about here. And recall I said I'm going to use string here, so str. It's already been pre-populated as string being the default here. But this little pop-down window here, and we'll play with a few of these other ones here momentarily. These are the other types of variable types that we can assign to this specific variable. And again, what can this variable hold? What type of values can, in this case, str, my first variable, what can it hold? You want, again, these names to be meaningful to your automation. What are they about? What is this box holding? This is the kitchen box. This is the bathroom box in the context of moving. It holds, in this case, this type of value or this type of context as it pertains to your specific automation. So at this rate, the next one, it's a bit hard to demonstrate here, but when we get into some of our future activities on down the road, this idea of scope, this is talking about where is this variable in our overall automation available or known to. So scope talking about, if we add a for each loop that we'll talk about later on down the road, we've got the ability for this variable to only be known inside that loop and not anywhere outside of it. What I always try to encourage folks to do is to make sure the scope here is always set at what I call the highest level, the most broadest level, just so we don't necessarily lose that variable in the overall automation. So you'll notice the word sequence here is implying the sequence here, all the activities collectively within this single blue box here. So kind of a bad example that we only have a single activity, but what it's talking about is this variable here is known anywhere inside this blue box. So any of the activities that would be found inside of this blue box here because of this being sequence. If we added some additional activities in here, we could narrow the scope of the variable down to specific activities depending on if that particular activity allows the scope to be set at that level or not. Then we have what we call the default value here. And the default, all this allows us to do is set what we would call an initial value into this variable, or place a item into the moving box when the program first runs, when the automation first runs. Without a value specified here, the box is empty, the variable is empty, it does not contain any particular or specific value. So to demonstrate this, what I'm going to do with the right line activity, recall this allows us, we did this in practice here, we did the hello world a moment ago. In this case, I'm going to change this up a little bit, and if you have not already started to follow along with me, please do so. Go ahead and create your project if you haven't done so. Inside of main, add a right line activity, enter in str, my first variable here. And at this rate, I am going to say the value inside of str, my first variable is colon in the quote. If I run my automation here, what you're going to see is simply like our hello world. Nothing too exciting is going to happen other than that text I just typed. Inside the right line displays on the screen, it is right here. Notice there is no text showing up after this yet. We're about, and notice keyword yet. I'm getting ready to do that as we speak. So go ahead and type in this case, the value inside of my str, my first variable is, make sure that's inside of double quotes. Hit the play button up here and you should get the same result that I have generated here. Hopefully you had some success there. What I want to do now is actually see what's inside the variable, see what's inside the box. Open the lid up on the box, see what's inside of it. So in order to do this, I want to do what is known as a concatenation here. I want to take the explicit text that I wrote here and concatenate it or connect it to or append to. Notice what I'm doing here is I put the double quote. At the end of the double quote, I put the plus sign. This is what we call a concatenation operator. It's going to take the text that I already wrote. If I start to type str, notice it will prompt for the str, my first variable. If I hit tab at this very moment, it will auto-complete the variable name inside this right line. If I hit run here, nothing is going to change, and the reason why, it goes back to what I just said a moment ago, the box right now is still empty. I have not put any value inside of the variable str, my first variable. So if I wanted to put a value in, go ahead and run this and see what you have. Make sure you have your text here, the little 3 dots here, which allows me to have a bit more real estate. This is exactly what I've typed in right here. Quote, the value inside of str, my first variable, is plus for concatenation str, my first variable. If you run that, you should get this result here. Again, it's still blank, but this time I'm actually saying look inside the box as opposed to the first time I ran this. If I type in the default value here, I'm going to simply put my name. Remember, default value will ensure this variable has a value when the automation begins, when it first executes. So when I hit save and run here, you'll notice now we will get an output, in this case, my name. Feel free to put your name or any other value. So you should now get the value inside of str, my first variable is, and then here's the EM line taken from the default value right here. Again, is a generic variable name, str, my first variable. Depending on your application, this is where you want to make sure that variable has a meaningful name. You need to know what this box is, what this container is. What does this variable, again, what does it hold? What does that variable contain? That's what we're after here. To have a little bit more fun with this, maybe see a bit more practicality behind this specific variable here, let's bring in an activity known as an input box. Input dialog. So if I drag this activity in and place it right above the right line, make sure this is right above the right line. You'll notice here, dialog title, this is what the title of the box is going to be. I'm going to call this enter value into a variable. This is where we can begin to be a bit more dynamic with our approach here. Enter value into a variable. In this next box here, please enter a value to go inside of the, let's say in a single quote, str, my first variable, and then quote. In this case, I want to bring in text box. We've got the ability to do more of a multiple choice option. And then in this case, value entered. You'll notice is our result down here. This is what variable will hold the result. So str, my first variable, you'll notice shows up here. So whatever we type into this input dialog box, when it shows up on the screen, will go into, this is going to place something into the box. In this case, it's going to assign whatever we type into this variable, str, my first variable. And since we have the right line, that text will show up here. So hit save and run here. I should get a pop-up box on my screen, which I do. Notice the enter value into a variable is showing up from this title. And the please enter a value to go inside of str, my first variable, is this input label. Here's where we can type in a value. I'm going to simply type in ABC 123. And as I hit OK, this result here will go into the box, into this variable. When it does that, when we hit the right line here, I should see ABC123 show up in my output window over here. So please follow along with me here. Go ahead and hit OK, and you'll notice the value inside of my first variable is ABC123. Were you successful? I sure hope so. Playing around with this a bit more, let's add another, first off, before we do that, let's change our input dialog here and simply say enter first. How about this? Enter a, yeah, you know what? Enter first number. Let's make a bit more of a realistic project here. Enter the first number here. We'll allow this to be a text box. In this case, I want to change my variable. What we can do here, if you want to get rid of a variable, is you can right click on it in our list box down here and hit delete. Notice at this rate, str first variable is here. It's saying the variable is not declared. Variables have to be declared before you can use them. And what we're talking about declared is what we did here when we created the entry here inside of the variables. In this case, I want to say str number 1. So I'm going to create a new variable. Go ahead and leave it as type string for now, and it still is part of the sequence. I want to create another one, str number 2, also as a type string, still tied into sequence. Let's change our right line as well while we're here, and take it down to number 1 is quote str number 1. Recall we talked about the ability to copy and paste. I could say copy here, and then right click and say paste, and I'll get another right line here. I want to say number 1 is, then number 2 is, and say number 2. In this case, in our first number, I need to also change my value here to say str number 1. Notice the error goes away, everything's happy. I want to do another copy on input dialog here, right underneath it, and paste again. In this case, enter first number needs to become second number. Enter the second number again, and change our value to 2, and hit save. So now I'll get 2 input boxes. The first one, as it runs, says enter the first number. Let's enter number 5. And if I hit enter, the second number box shows up. I will hit 7. As I do that, notice 5 and 7 are the 2 variables. So I've officially assigned 2 numbers together. I've got 2 variables now, 2 boxes. Recall each box or each variable can only hold 1 item at a time. That is why I have 2 variables at this moment in time. Notice I don't have any default values. I'm populating these from user input coming off of the input dialog. Give everybody a moment to catch up here for just a second. Notice I'm taking values in, but they're coming in as type string. Recall I said a moment ago, string does not allow for native computation. You can't actually add these 2 numbers together. And in order to try to demonstrate this, let's bring another, you know what, first off, in order to be able to do this, let's bring in a, no, you know what, let's do a right line again. Bring another right line in here. Let's say right here, the sum, so let's add these numbers together. The sum of int number, yep, I did not say that right. Sum of, let's just say number 1 and number 2 is, quote, if I say str number 1 plus str number 2, I do need a plus here though. So let me put this in a bit bigger view that everybody can see. So this is my third right line down here. I said the sum of number 1 and number 2 is, I have to have this for concatenation, but I'm hoping to add these 2 numbers together. str number 1 and str number 2. So if I do this now and I run our automation here, I should get the same prompts again. Enter the first number. Let's go 4 this time, and there's the second number. So 4 and 9. Notice what has happened. It took number 1 is 4, number 9. Notice 4 plus 9 is not 49. What it did is it concatenated these as text. It took the 4 and the 9 as just plain text, not a number per se, put them side by side. This is what we call string concatenation. It's simply bringing the numbers together. I was hoping it would add 4 and 9. The way I have to do this is by coming into here and bringing in a assign activity. So this assign activity, if I bring this in right above the right line, notice it's getting a little mad at me. I need the ability to add these two numbers together. Again, I'm kind of setting this up here. I just told everybody that we can't add strings. Well, we kind of can. There's ways of doing this, and I'm about to demonstrate that here. I obviously need something to hold the resulting value here. So let's say str result, so string result. Notice when I type that, it's saying that it has not been declared. What I can do here in the assign, one shortcut for creating new variables is to hold the control and press the letter K, and you notice it says set var, set variable, or declare a variable. So when I hit control K here, I want to type in str result. What is the result of the calculation? If I hit enter, notice what it's done, str result as variable type string. Should automatically pick that up for me. You may have to make changes here in the road, down the road, depending on what you want this variable to hold. It may not necessarily always get it right by guessing string. You may have to come in here and make a modification as to the type of value you want this particular variable to hold, and as well as where should this variable be known. In this case, sequence is the only option readily available to us at this point. So now I should simply be able to say str result, take str number 1 and add it to str number 2, right? I've got no errors. Let's update our right line down here. I should be able to say str result now. Notice I have no errors here. Everything's happy. Let's save and run. Got my number 1 on the screen. It showed up underneath there. That's why it took me a second to find it. I'm going to type in a 7 and how about 10 this time? You know what? Let's keep it simple. Make it 9. Notice it's the same issue. I'm adding them up, right? Remember, this is string, it's text. It does the same thing here. So that's why we have 7, 9, and it concatenates them back together. I'm not actually adding the numbers yet. What I need to be able to do here is a thing we call typecasting. It's the ability to change the data type on the fly, being able to change these variables into variables that allow for computation. And in order to do this, notice I'm on the assign here. I want to look in the value option here. And since these are strings, I would need to convert them into integers. And in order to do that, if I type in cint and do an open parenthesis, this is a function that allows me to convert, in this case, str number 1 to a number. I have to do the same on the other side, cint, convert to integer, convert to a number. On each of those, if I hit OK, you'll notice I now get another error. What this is saying is it cannot convert. So now it's taken the strings, text, it's converted them to number, it's added them together. Now it's saying I've got a number over here. I have an integer value and I'm trying to put it into a string. I can't do this. So what I'm going to do to try to make this a little bit cleaner, plus as well for demonstration point of view, let's change int result. Instead of being a string, let's put int in front of result and change the data type this time to hold a number, have it hold a integer. If I make that change, notice the error goes away here, but now I have a new error that's occurred down here on right line. Let me walk through these. So what it's now done is it's saying take string again to string, but recall we converted both to numbers. So take a number now that's been converted, another number, add these together. And the error we had before, it was saying take this combined result, two numbers being added together, and attempt to put it in a text-based field, a string-defined box, a string-defined variable. So to fix that, we decided we would convert that variable into an integer. So now we're saying take two numbers, two integers, and convert them, and then add them and place them into another number, an integer. So a number put into another number, the calculated value put into another number. The problem now that's occurred is down here in our text, it's saying we cannot convert, in this case, a number to text. The right line, it expects, notice here, everything to be of type string. Now all of a sudden we have a number in here. The concatenation is trying to take text and add it to a number. You can't add text to a number. This is thinking it's going to actually do, mathematical calculation. But then the bigger pieces is right line expects this entire thing to be string. So in a similar fashion to how we converted a string to a number with convert to integer, in order to be able to get the result here to properly display, we need to typecast a number back to a string. And it's unfortunately not quite the same where we could say like C string out here. The way numbers and other data types are converted to string is at the very end of the string, we type in a dot and type in to string. Notice as soon as I do that, the error goes away and the conversion is happy. It's now taking the number, converting it to a string. So now it's again string and concatenating. So the plus being connect these two, in this case, to another string. We should have the resultant answer in a computed form here. So let's go ahead and save with our changes and rerun. Number one prompt should show up on the screen. Let's make it a 3. And the second number, make it 6. And if I hit enter here, you'll now notice number 1 was a 3, number 2 was a 6, and now notice the sum of number 1 and number 2 is 9. It has officially, in this assign statement, converted the 3 to an actual computable number and the 6 to an actual computable number. Has added those two together, an actual mathematical calculation. It's then made the 9 here, put it into the variable or the box of int result, in this case being the number 9. And when we did the right line down here, it's simply, as plain text reads, the sum of number 1 and number 2 is, and then the 9 as a number gets converted to a string, which is required in the right line, and all that gets concatenated together, resulting us in the final value here. This concludes the exercise in variables, data typing, and dealing with, in this case, typecasting, being able to convert from one data type to another. One additional and kind of closing thought that I want to bring to everybody's attention is notice there are multiple data types that are available, as well as getting down into this browse for types option below. So if it's not a variable that's in that native list, eventually we'll get into a data type of what we call dictionary. If I can spell is the next challenge. In this case, dictionary. Notice we have this key value pair relationship. I don't want to get into a lot of detail here, but the ability to be able to bring in additional data types is afforded and available to us. One thing that I always try to point out here when we talk about additional variable data types is to look for in our list here this MS Core lib or Microsoft Core library. In this case, these are your more common data types that are readily available to us. Again, as part of the .NET environment that we have. In this case, we'll talk about dictionary at a later time, but using this as an example of one of the other data types that we can bring in and we will commonly see utilized inside of UiPath later on down the road. But for now, we will keep it simple, focus on these specific Boolean true, false, yes, no, numbers, strings, as well as objects. We briefly mentioned data table when we talked about using the data scraping activity from before. And you heard me mention at the beginning of this conversation, talking about arrays, the ability of having a variable hold multiple values. And we'll have a conversation explicitly around arrays here in another couple of lessons. But for now, that concludes the overall conversation as it pertains to variables and their data types, as well as being able to manipulate the various ways of doing some typecasting, as well as computing and concatenation of the various variables. Look forward to seeing you in the next activity. Thank you.